August 14, 2019. The Mojave Desert warehouse was supposed to be empty until 6 a.m. Frank Morrison pulled up at 3:15, coffee still steaming, expecting 3 hours of blessed silence before the chaos of filming began. Instead, he found 5 young actors chained to explosive devices that looked exactly like movie props. The timer read 2 hours, 47 minutes. Each device was connected to motion sensors. One wrong move, and they all die. Frank had built similar rigs for action sequences. He knew these weren't fake. Someone had turned his own expertise against him. Someone who knew he'd arrive early. Someone who knew about Phoenix, about the accident, about what really happened that night 15 years ago. As Frank reached for his phone, he found the note. No police, no crew, just you and your guilt. You have until 6 a.m. to choose. Save them or save yourself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Frank's hands trembled as he read the note again, the words blurring in the harsh fluorescent light. The warehouse felt like a tomb, concrete walls that had witnessed countless fake deaths now hosting something horrifyingly real. The 5 actors, none older than 25 by his estimate, stared at him with a mixture of terror and desperate hope that made his chest tighten. He recognized the brunette from craft services yesterday, Sarah something. The tall kid with the nervous tic had asked him about wire work during rehearsals. Normal kids with normal dreams, now sitting in precision-engineered death traps that bore his signature style. The spacing between the charges, the redundant trigger mechanisms, even the way the chains were positioned to maximize psychological impact. It was like staring at his own blueprint from 15 years ago. The timer's red digits pulsed. 2:46:23. 2:46:22, 2:46:21. Frank forced himself to breathe, to think like the methodical professional he'd once been before guilt had eaten him hollow. Whoever orchestrated this knew him intimately, knew he'd arrive early because he always arrived early, knew he'd recognize the handiwork because it mirrored his own, knew he wouldn't run because running meant watching 5 more kids die on his watch. The motion sensors were military grade, their red eyes scanning in overlapping patterns. Each actor sat perfectly still, understanding instinctively that even a sneeze could trigger the cascade. Smart kids. That might buy him time. But time for what? The note had been clear. No police, no crew, just him and the weight of Phoenix pressing down like desert heat. Phoenix Studios, 2004. His protege Danny Chen, 23 and brilliant, trusting Frank's rushed calculations because the studio needed the sequence shot before they lost their location permit. The cable snapped during the 4th take. Danny fell 60 feet into concrete while Frank watched from the monitors, knowing in that crystalline moment of horror that he'd miscalculated the load distribution. The official report blamed equipment failure. The studio's lawyers made sure of it, sealing records and settling with Danny's family for enough money to make questions disappear. Frank's reputation remained intact, his career untouchable. Only 3 people knew the truth about the corner cutting, about the falsified safety reports, about the studio executive who'd threatened Frank's future if he didn't deliver on schedule. Frank Morrison, studio head Marcus Kellerman, and safety inspector Patricia Vega, who'd signed off on the rigging despite Frank's whispered concerns. Now someone else knew. Frank circled the perimeter, staying well outside the sensor range, cataloging every detail. The warehouse had been transformed overnight. Cameras positioned at strategic angles, though whether for surveillance or recording he couldn't tell. The props department had been raided. He recognized scenic elements from 3 different productions scattered around like a madman's movie set. "Sir?" The brunette's voice was barely a whisper. "Are you going to help us?" "I'm going to get you out of here," Frank said, surprised by the steadiness in his voice. "All of you. But I need you to stay absolutely still." "Can you do that?" Nods all around. Good kids. They deserve better than being chess pieces in someone's revenge fantasy. Frank knelt beside the nearest device, careful not to trigger the motion sensors. The craftsmanship was exquisite. Professional-grade explosives wired through a central hub that would detonate everything simultaneously if tampered with incorrectly. But there were tells, signatures in the wiring pattern that tugged at his memory. This wasn't the work of an amateur seeking justice for Danny Chen's death. This was the work of someone who understood Frank's psychology, who knew he'd approach the problem systematically, who wanted him focused on the technical challenge while missing the larger picture. Someone who needed Frank here, in this moment, making this choice, for reasons that had nothing to do with Phoenix. The realization hit him like ice water. This wasn't about the past. This was about right now, about what Frank had stumbled into by arriving early, about what these 5 actors had seen or heard that made them liabilities. Someone was using Frank's guilt as cover, banking on his reputation for self-sacrifice to keep him from asking the right questions. But Frank Morrison hadn't survived 30 years in Hollywood by being anyone's fool. He'd learned to read between the lines, to spot the con within the con, and right now, somewhere in this elaborate theater of revenge, the real crime was taking place. The timer read 2:31:15. Still enough time to save them, if he was smart about it. If he could resist the bait of his own guilt long enough to see the bigger picture. If he could remember that sometimes the best way to honor the dead was to prevent more graves from being dug. Frank pulled out his phone and started typing a message he prayed would reach the right person before 6 a.m. changed everything. Before we continue this race against time tomorrow, tell us in the comments which character you're most worried about. And if this story has its hooks in you, hit that subscribe button, because Chapter 2 reveals something about Frank's past that changes everything. The message cursor blinked on Frank's phone screen like a heartbeat, each pulse reminding him of the seconds bleeding away. His thick fingers hovered over the keyboard, muscle memory warring with 15 years of careful silence. There was only one person who might understand the sophistication of this setup, who'd know how to trace the equipment back to its source. Patricia Vega, the safety inspector who'd co-signed his lies. Pat, need immediate trace on warehouse rental, 47th and Industrial. Someone's using Phoenix to cover something bigger. 5 lives at stake. Frank. He hit send before he could second-guess himself, then powered down the phone. Whoever orchestrated this would be monitoring communications, but Pat was smart enough to read between the lines. She'd always been smarter than him, which made her complicity in the cover-up all the more devastating. The warehouse fell silent except for the timer's electronic whisper and the soft breathing of 5 terrified kids. Frank closed his eyes and let the familiar weight of responsibility settle across his shoulders like an old leather jacket. This feeling, standing between life and death, calculating angles and forces and human frailty, had defined him long before Danny Chen's broken body made it unbearable. He'd been 16 when he first realized he could see death coming. Not psychic nonsense, but a practical recognition of physics and human error. His father's construction crew was raising a beam when Frank noticed the crane's positioning, the way the load shifted in the wind, the operator's attention drifting toward his lunch break. Frank's shout had saved 3 men that day, though his old man had cuffed him for speaking out of turn. Kid sees things, his father had grudgingly admitted to the crew boss. Might be useful. Useful. That's what Frank had been for 30 years, a human calculator of catastrophe, preventing disasters through meticulous preparation and obsessive double-checking. Directors called him paranoid. Producers complained about his safety requirements, adding weeks to shooting schedules. Stunt performers trusted him with their lives because Frank Morrison never cut corners, until he did. The memory hit him like it always did, sudden and complete. Danny's face that morning, excited about the wire sequence they'd rehearsed a dozen times, the studio executive pacing behind the monitors, checking his watch, muttering about permit deadlines and budget overruns. The pressure building in Frank's chest as he stared at calculations that needed another day, maybe 2, to verify properly. It'll hold, he'd told himself, signing off on rigging that felt wrong in his gut. 1 take, maybe 2, it'll hold. It hadn't. Frank opened his eyes and forced himself to focus on the present crisis. The brunette, Sarah, was watching him with an expression that reminded him painfully of Danny's trust. The tall kid's nervous tick had stopped. Fear had frozen him into perfect stillness. The other 3, 2 young men and another woman, sat like statues, understanding instinctively that their lives depended on immobility. But there was something else in their faces, something beyond the immediate terror. Recognition? No, that wasn't quite right. More like resignation, as if they'd been expecting this. Sarah, Frank said quietly, testing his theory. What did you see yesterday? Her eyes flickered, a micro-expression that confirmed his suspicion. These kids hadn't been chosen randomly. They knew something, had witnessed something that made them dangerous to someone powerful enough to orchestrate this elaborate execution. "I can't," she started, then stopped as one of the motion sensors adjusted its angle. "Not yet," Frank agreed. "But when we get out of here, and we will get out of here, we're going to talk about what brought you to this warehouse before call time." The timer showed 2:18:44. Still manageable, if he could resist the emotional manipulation and think tactically. Someone wanted him paralyzed by guilt, focused on the past instead of the present crime. Someone who understood that Frank's greatest weakness wasn't his ego or his fear, but his desperate need to atone for Danny Chen's death. Frank Morrison had spent 15 years in exile, taking low-budget consultation jobs in the Nevada desert, living in a trailer park outside Henderson, avoiding the studio lots where Danny's ghost waited around every corner. He'd built a quiet life of small redemptions, preventing minor accidents on forgettable films, teaching young stunt coordinators to double-check their calculations, volunteering at a community center where at risk kids learned practical skills instead of dangerous dreams. It wasn't much of a life, but it was his penance. Until someone decided to weaponize his guilt. The warehouse's emergency exit caught his attention, positioned just outside the motion sensor's coverage, but visible from every chair. Deliberate placement, designed to torment the victims with proximity to freedom. But also a blind spot, a staging area where Frank could work without triggering the sensors. He moved carefully toward the exit, mind already cataloging the tools he'd need from his truck. Wire cutters, voltage meter, his old frequency scanner that might pick up the detonation signal. 30 years of experience against one person's elaborate revenge fantasy. But first, he needed to understand why these 5 specific actors had to die, and why someone thought Frank Morrison's guilt was the perfect murder weapon. Frank reached for the emergency exit handle when his phone vibrated against his chest, a sound that shouldn't exist. He'd powered it down. The device was receiving messages despite being offline, which meant someone had remote access, someone who wanted him to see what was coming through. Against every instinct screaming danger, he pulled out the phone. The screen flickered to life without his input, displaying a single message from an unknown number. "Hello, Frank. Did you really think Patricia Vega was the only one who knew?" His blood turned to ice. The phone buzzed again. "Check your email, the one you haven't opened in 3 years. Frank's hands shook as he accessed his old studio account, the one from his Phoenix days that he'd abandoned after the accident. His inbox showed hundreds of unread messages, but one had arrived just minutes ago. The sender's name made his knees buckle. Danny Chen. The subject line read, "The truth about Phoenix. Urgent." With mounting horror, Frank opened the message. It contained a single video file and a brief note. "Frank, if you're reading this, something's happened to me. I set this email to send automatically if I didn't log in for 72 hours. The warehouse footage below shows what really happened the night before my accident. You need to see who visited the rigging. You need to know it wasn't your mistake that killed me. Someone wanted me dead. And now they want you to suffer for it. The safety calculations you second-guessed? I found them in my trailer 3 hours before the fall. Someone had altered them. The real numbers would have held. Your original assessment was correct. I tried to tell you that morning, but Marcus Kellerman pulled me aside first. He knew I'd discovered the sabotage. He told me to keep quiet or my sister would lose her scholarship, her future. So I said nothing. I let you blame yourself for 15 years. I'm sorry, Frank." The 5 actors in that warehouse were the film students working security that night. They were reviewing old footage for a documentary about studio accidents. They found the same video I did. Stop blaming yourself and start running. Patricia Vega didn't co-sign your lies. She's been investigating the cover-up. And Marcus Kellerman just became head of Phoenix's parent company. Find the real killer before he finds you. Frank stared at the screen, his entire world reshaping itself around this revelation. 15 years of guilt, 15 years of exile and self-imposed penance, all built on a lie. Danny had been murdered, and Frank had been the perfect patsy, too consumed by manufactured guilt to ask the right questions. The video file began playing automatically. Grainy security footage from the Phoenix lot, time-stamped 11:47 p.m., the night before Danny's death. Frank watched his younger self leave the rigging area, confident in his calculations. 20 minutes later, a figure entered the frame, tall, authoritative, moving with purpose toward the cable assembly. Marcus Kellerman. The studio head spent 18 minutes at the rigging point, his actions partially obscured by shadows. But Frank could see enough. Tools being used, adjustments being made, sabotage disguised as maintenance. When Kellerman left, he carried a manila envelope, the original safety reports Danny had mentioned, the real calculations that would have saved his life. Frank's phone buzzed with another message. You have 2 hours and 12 minutes to choose, Frank. Save the 5 witnesses and expose the truth, or let them die and keep the secret buried forever. Either way, you won't leave that warehouse alive. Marcus is very thorough about loose ends. Consider this Danny's gift to you, the chance to finally understand what really happened, the chance to stop carrying guilt that was never yours to bear. But understanding comes with a price. Those 5 actors are bait, but not for revenge. They're bait to get you in the same room as the evidence they found. Evidence that could destroy Phoenix Studios and put Marcus Kellerman in prison. He's been watching you for 15 years, Frank, waiting. When the actors found the footage, he saw his chance to eliminate all the witnesses at once, including the only man who could interpret what really happened that night. The warehouse is surrounded. You have 2 hours to save them and yourself. Danny's camera equipment is hidden in Unit 7B, northeast corner. Everything you need to prove the truth. Don't let us die for nothing. Frank deleted the messages, his mind racing. This wasn't about his guilt anymore. It had never been about his guilt. Marcus Kellerman had orchestrated Danny's murder and spent 15 years letting Frank destroy himself over a crime he didn't commit. Now those 5 kids were going to die to protect a secret that had already stolen too many lives. But for the first time in 15 years, Frank Morrison felt something other than crushing guilt. He felt rage. Pure, focused, righteous anger at the man who'd stolen his life, his reputation, his peace of mind. Danny Chen hadn't died because Frank cut corners. He'd died because he'd threatened a powerful man's empire. And Frank Morrison was done being anyone's victim. The timer read 2:11:33 when Frank made his choice. He wasn't saving 5 actors anymore. He was saving 5 witnesses and getting justice for Danny Chen. The rage lasted exactly 43 seconds before reality crashed back down. Frank stood frozen in the emergency exit doorway, his phone still warm in his hands, understanding finally that he'd been dancing to someone else's choreography from the moment he'd stepped into this warehouse. Marcus Kellerman wanted him here, expected him here, had probably counted on Frank's guilt driving him to arrive early, to walk into this trap with the predictable nobility of a man seeking redemption. 15 years of psychological manipulation, and Frank had stumbled right into the finale. But knowing the truth didn't change the physics of the situation. 5 kids still sat motionless in rigged chairs. Motion sensors still tracked every twitch. The timer still counted down towards 6 a.m. with mechanical indifference. Understanding Kellerman's game plan was one thing. Surviving it was another entirely. Frank forced himself to think tactically. If the warehouse was surrounded, his truck was already compromised. If Kellerman had remote access to his phone, every call would be monitored. If Patricia Vega was investigating the cover-up, she might already be dead. The isolation was complete, professional, thorough. He pocketed the phone and moved back toward the actors, careful to stay outside the sensor grid. Their faces tracked his movement with desperate hope, but Frank could see something else now, the weight of secrets. These weren't random film students. They were survivors, witnesses to something that had marked them for death. "How long have you known about the Phoenix footage?" he asked quietly. The brunette, Sarah, closed her eyes. 3 weeks. We were digitizing old security tapes for Professor Martinez's documentary on studio safety. We thought we'd found something important, something that could help families get justice for covered-up accidents. "We tried to go through proper channels," the tall kid whispered. "Submitted our findings to the studio's legal department. Asked for interviews with safety personnel. We thought we were being responsible." Frank's stomach dropped. Of course they had. 5 idealistic film students, believing in truth and transparency, walking straight into the lion's den. They'd probably provided Kellerman with a detailed outline of their evidence, their sources, their timeline for publication. Marcus Kellerman himself called our professor, another student added, offered to fund our research, suggested we move our interviews to a private location, said Phoenix Studios wanted to cooperate fully with our investigation. The setup was elegant in its simplicity. Kellerman had used the students' own honesty against them, luring them to this remote warehouse with promises of cooperation while arranging their execution. And Frank, predictable, guilt-ridden Frank, had provided the perfect cover story. A tragic accident during an elaborate revenge plot against the negligent stunt coordinator who'd finally snapped. But Frank Morrison hadn't survived 30 years in Hollywood by underestimating human ambition. He understood how powerful men protected their empires, how they turned allies into assets and enemies into cautionary tales. Kellerman's mistake was assuming that 15 years of exile had made Frank soft. He circled the chair arrangement again, this time looking for the real trap, not the obvious motion sensors and explosive devices, but the psychological snare beneath. Kellerman needed Frank to attempt a rescue, needed him focused on the technical challenge while missing the larger game. The timer, the complexity, the moral weight of 5 innocent lives, all designed to keep Frank from asking the essential question, where was the real evidence? Unit 7 billions, the mysterious message had claimed. Danny's camera equipment, everything needed to prove the truth. But Frank had learned to distrust convenient revelations, especially ones that arrived precisely when desperation peaked. If Kellerman was sophisticated enough to orchestrate 15 years of psychological manipulation, he was smart enough to control the flow of information in this final act. Frank's phone vibrated again. This time he didn't reach for it immediately, understanding that each message was designed to escalate his emotional state, to keep him reactive instead of analytical. The device buzzed insistently against his ribs, a technological heartbeat counting down to disaster. Finally, he checked the screen. 2 hours remaining, Frank. Patricia Vega's body was found an hour ago. Car accident on Highway 95. Very tragic, very convenient. You're alone now. No cavalry coming. No one left who remembers the truth except you and these 5 witnesses. Choose quickly, save them and die with them, or walk away and live with fresh guilt. But before you decide, check the security monitor behind you. See who's watching. Frank turned slowly toward a small black screen mounted near the emergency exit. The monitor flickered to life, displaying a split-screen view, the warehouse interior on the left, showing Frank and the trapped students, and on the right, Marcus Kellerman sat in what appeared to be a mobile command vehicle, his silver hair perfectly styled, his expression calm and attentive. He was close, maybe a quarter-mile away, close enough to enjoy the show. The studio head noticed Frank looking, and offered a small wave, then held up a wireless detonator. Frank Morrison finally understood. This wasn't about revenge or justice, or even covering up past crimes. This was about entertainment. Frank stared at the monitor, watching Marcus Kellerman's theatrical wave, and felt something crack inside his chest. Not his resolve, but the last protective shell around 15 years of carefully buried rage. The studio head's casual gesture, that smug little acknowledgement of control, stripped away every psychological defense Frank had built since Danny's death. "You son of a bitch," Frank whispered, his voice carrying a weight that made the trapped students flinch. "You're enjoying this." Kellerman leaned forward in his command vehicle, pressing a button that activated 2-way audio through the monitor. His voice filled the warehouse with the same smooth authority Frank remembered from budget meetings and safety briefings. "Hello, Frank. You look older. The guilt has aged you poorly, I'm afraid." The students exchanged terrified glances as Frank stepped closer to the monitor, his face hardening into something they hadn't seen before. Not desperation or determination, but the cold fury of a man who'd spent 15 years blaming himself for another man's murder. "Danny tried to tell me that morning," Frank said, his voice steady despite the storm building in his chest. "He was scared, wasn't he? Scared of you." "Danny was naive," Kellerman replied with casual dismissal. He thought idealism could protect him from economic reality. The Phoenix merger required certain narrative adjustments. His accident provided excellent leverage for regulatory approval. Tragic, but necessary. The brunette student, Sarah, made a small sound of horror. Frank could see her processing the revelation that they weren't just witnesses to a cover-up, but props in an ongoing performance of corporate psychopathy. Economic reality, Frank repeated, tasting the words like poison. You killed a 24-year-old kid for a fucking merger? Kellerman's expression remained pleasant, but something predatory flickered behind his eyes. I killed no one, Frank. You did. Your reputation for cutting corners under pressure was already established. Your guilt these past 15 years has been quite convincing. Even you believed it. Frank's hands clenched into fists as the full scope of the manipulation became clear. Not just Danny's murder, not just the cover-up, but 15 years of psychological torture designed to create the perfect fall guy. Every sleepless night, every bottle of whiskey, every moment of self-loathing, Kellerman had orchestrated it all. The safety reports you found in Danny's trailer, Frank said, pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. You planted them there. Danny was investigating discrepancies in the rigging specifications, Kellerman confirmed. Bright boy, very thorough. Unfortunately, thoroughness can be a terminal condition in this business. The tall student shifted in his chair, triggering a proximity alarm that made everyone freeze. The motion sensors recalibrated with mechanical precision, red laser dots dancing across his chest before settling back into standby mode. Frank used the distraction to study the bomb mechanisms more carefully. The devices weren't just explosive charges, they were cameras. Kellerman wasn't just planning to kill them, he was documenting it, probably for insurance investigators who would need to verify the tragic accident that befell a disturbed ex-stunt coordinator and 5 unfortunate witnesses. The documentary these kids were making, Frank said, forcing his voice to remain calm. It wasn't about studio safety generally, was it? Sarah's eyes met his, confirming his suspicion. It was specifically about the Phoenix merger, about how Danny Chen's death influenced regulatory approval. We found internal memos, correspondence between Phoenix executives and federal oversight committees. The accident made Phoenix look responsible, safety conscious, another student added. They implemented new protocols, hired additional coordinators. It actually improved their merger prospects. Frank felt the final pieces of the puzzle sliding into place. Danny hadn't just been murdered for threatening the merger. His death had been weaponized to facilitate it. Kellerman had turned tragedy into profit, using Frank's reputation and Danny's corpse as marketing materials for corporate responsibility. And now you want to clean up the loose ends, Frank said, looking directly into the camera. Make sure nobody ever connects Danny's death to Phoenix's current market position. Current? Kellerman laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Frank, Phoenix Studios was acquired last year by Meridian Entertainment. I'm now CEO of the largest media conglomerate in North America. Danny's little accident has been remarkably profitable over the years. The timer read 1:47:22, but Frank no longer felt the pressure of approaching deadline. Instead, he felt the cold clarity that came from understanding his enemy completely. Kellerman hadn't just stolen Danny's life. He'd built an empire on that theft, rising through corporate ranks while Frank rotted in desert exile. But Kellerman had made one crucial miscalculation. He'd assumed that 15 years of guilt had broken Frank Morrison's spirit, had transformed him into a victim too damaged to fight back. He was about to learn how wrong he was. Frank stepped back from the monitor and began walking the perimeter of the sensor grid again. But this time, he wasn't looking for ways to disarm the trap. He was looking for ways to turn it against its creator. Keep talking, Marcus, Frank said quietly. Keep explaining how clever you are, because every word you say is being recorded by your own equipment. And every minute you waste brings these children closer to death. Frank smiled for the first time in hours, an expression that made the students more nervous than his earlier desperation. Maybe, he said, but it also brings you closer to me. The smile faded from Frank's face as the full weight of revelation settled over him like desert sand. 15 years. 15 goddamn years of carrying guilt that had never been his to bear, while Marcus Kellerman climbed corporate ladders built from Danny Chen's bones. But something else crystallized in that moment. something that made Frank's blood freeze despite the Nevada heat still radiating through the warehouse walls. The timing, the elaborate setup, the careful psychological manipulation. This wasn't just about covering up Danny's murder anymore. "You needed me here," Frank said slowly, his voice cutting through the warehouse silence. "Not just to die with them. You needed me here specifically." Kellerman's expression on the monitor shifted slightly, the practiced corporate mask slipping for just a fraction of a second. It was enough. "The documentary footage," Frank continued, pieces clicking together with horrible clarity. "These kids didn't just find evidence of Danny's murder. They found something else, something recent." Sarah's eyes widened, understanding flashing across her face. "The merger documents," she whispered. "The Meridian acquisition papers." Frank felt the warehouse tilt around him as the final, devastating truth emerged. "Tell me, Marcus. Tell me what else they found." The silence stretched for 10 seconds, 20. Then Kellerman leaned back in his command vehicle chair and Frank saw it, the first crack in 15 years of perfect control. "They found the real financial records," Kellerman said quietly. "The ones showing Danny wasn't killed for the Phoenix merger. He was killed because he'd discovered I was already embezzling from Phoenix's safety budget. The merger was just convenient timing." Frank's legs nearly gave out. The students stared at him in horror as the implications crashed down like rigging cables snapping under impossible weight. "Danny wasn't investigating merger discrepancies," Frank said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He was investigating you stealing money meant to keep people alive." 17 million over 3 years, Kellerman confirmed with clinical precision. "Danny found the discrepancies during a routine budget audit. Young fool thought he could blackmail me into restoring the safety funds. Said he'd go public if I didn't confess and make restitution." The warehouse seemed to shrink around Frank as 15 years of carefully constructed narrative collapsed. Danny hadn't died for corporate politics or merger complications. He'd died because he'd tried to protect people like Frank, tried to ensure that safety protocols had proper funding, that stunt coordinators had the resources they needed to keep actors alive. Danny had died trying to save Frank's career, Frank's reputation, Frank's ability to do the job he loved safely, and Frank had spent 15 years believing he'd killed his protégé through negligence. "The accident," Frank said, his voice cracking. "The rigging failure. It wasn't because I cut corners under studio pressure. It was because you'd stolen the money for proper equipment. 40% budget reduction across all safety departments," Kellerman said with satisfaction. "Very impressive cost savings. The board was quite pleased with my efficiency initiatives." Frank looked at the 5 trapped students, kids who'd stumbled onto the same truth Danny had discovered, kids who'd made the same fatal mistake of believing justice mattered more than profit margins. But unlike Danny, they'd had each other. They'd documented everything, shared their findings, built a network of evidence that couldn't be eliminated by killing one idealistic investigator. "That's why you need me here," Frank realized. "Not just as a fall guy. You need the legendary Frank Morrison, the man who trained Danny Chen to validate whatever story you're planning to tell about these kids. Need my presence here to make the narrative work." Frank Morrison, consumed by 15 years of guilt, finally snaps and takes revenge on innocent students. Kellerman recited like a movie pitch. Tragic end to a once brilliant career destroyed by a single moment of negligence. Very compelling. The media will eat it up. But Frank was no longer listening to Kellerman's words. He was listening to something else, the subtle change in the man's voice, the slight tension that suggested proximity, the ambient sound bleeding through the audio connection. He was close, very close. Close enough that Frank could hear the desert wind against Kellerman's vehicle through the monitor speakers. And then Frank understood the final piece of Kellerman's arrogance, the crucial miscalculation that would destroy him. "You're not in a mobile command vehicle," Frank said quietly. "You're in the warehouse office. You've been here the whole time, haven't you? Watching, directing, making sure everything goes according to script." The monitor went black. Frank smiled again, but this time the expression held no warmth whatsoever. After 15 years of guilt, 15 years of exile, 15 years of believing he'd failed the one person who trusted him most, Frank Morrison finally knew exactly who his real enemy was, and Marcus Kellerman had just made the fatal mistake of putting himself within reach. Frank stood motionless in the sudden darkness, the monitor's black screen reflecting his weathered face like a gravestone. The warehouse had become a cathedral of silence, broken only by the shallow breathing of 5 terrified students and the mechanical hum of proximity sensors recalibrating in the shadows. 103 minutes on the timer. Enough time for careful work, if Frank's hands remembered skills they'd spent 15 years trying to forget. He closed his eyes and let muscle memory guide him through mental blueprints of warehouse construction. Standard commercial building, probably 1990s vintage based on the electrical conduits he'd noticed earlier. Office space would be elevated, 2nd floor, accessed by external stairs to minimize disruption to storage areas. Kellerman was maybe 60 feet away, separated by concrete walls and the careful distance of a predator who'd grown comfortable watching his prey struggle. "Listen to me," Frank whispered to the students, his voice carrying the authority that had once commanded film sets employing hundreds of people. "When I move, you stay absolutely still. Don't try to help. Don't react to anything you see or hear. The sensors are motion activated, but they're calibrated for rescue attempts, not—" He paused, searching for words that wouldn't terrify them further. "Not other activities." Sarah's eyes reflected the emergency lighting like a trapped animal's. "What are you going to do?" Frank looked at her, really looked, and saw Danny's face 15 years younger, filled with the same desperate trust, the same belief that Frank Morrison could fix anything if he just applied enough skill and determination. The resemblance made his chest tighten, but this time the pain carried something else underneath it: purpose. "I'm going to have a conversation with Marcus about workplace safety," Frank said quietly. "About proper funding for equipment maintenance. About what happens when executives steal money meant to keep people alive." He moved toward the emergency exit with movements so controlled they seemed choreographed, each step placed with the precision of a man who'd spent decades working around sensitive equipment. The door's magnetic lock had been disabled, Kellerman's confidence ensuring Frank could move freely through the warehouse while remaining trapped by the larger situation. The desert air hit him like a physical blow, superheated by sun-baked concrete and carrying the scent of sage and motor oil. Kellerman's vehicle sat in the shadow of the warehouse's north wall, not a mobile command center as Frank had imagined, but a modified RV that spoke of long-term planning and careful preparation. The external stairs to the office space were exactly where Frank expected them, metal framework bolted to concrete walls with the kind of minimal safety margins that characterized low-budget construction. He tested the first step carefully, distributing his weight to minimize sound transmission, then began climbing with movements that belonged more to infiltration than legitimate access. Through the office window, he could see Kellerman's silhouette bent over multiple monitors displaying camera feeds from inside the warehouse. The studio head's attention was focused completely on his prisoners, watching for signs of panic or attempted escape. He held the wireless detonator casually in his left hand, fingers drumming against the device with the unconscious rhythm of a man accustomed to holding absolute power over life and death. Frank reached the office door and found it unlocked. Of course. Kellerman's arrogance was complete. Why secure a door when your enemies were safely trapped in an elaborately constructed death maze? The door opened silently on recently oiled hinges, and Frank stepped into a space that looked more like a film editing suite than a warehouse office. Banks of monitors displayed multiple camera angles, audio equipment recorded conversations, and sophisticated timing mechanisms coordinated with military precision. This wasn't a hastily arranged execution. It was a production, complete with multiple takes and post-production planning. Kellerman sensed the presence behind him a fraction of a second too late. He started to turn, hand tightening on the detonator, but Frank was already moving with reflexes honed by 30 years of preventing catastrophic accidents through split-second timing. Frank's hand closed around Kellerman's wrist, applying pressure to specific nerve points that made the studio head's fingers spasm involuntarily. The detonator clattered to the floor, skidding across polished concrete toward a bank of servers humming with recorded evidence. "Hello, Marcus," Frank said quietly, his grip maintaining just enough pressure to keep Kellerman immobilized without causing permanent damage. Yet. Let's discuss your safety protocols." Kellerman's face had gone pale, but his voice retained its corporate smoothness. "You can't kill me, Frank. I'm the only one who can disarm the system. Those kids die without my cooperation." Frank smiled, and this time the expression held everything he'd learned about human nature during 15 years of exile, in places where violence was currency and survival demanded absolute clarity about who deserved mercy. "Marcus," he said softly, "you seem to be under the impression that I came up here to negotiate." The timer on the monitors read 97 minutes. But Frank Morrison was no longer racing against time. He was about to become it. Frank's grip tightened incrementally, watching Kellerman's face cycle through emotions the man hadn't felt in decades. Fear, confusion, and the dawning realization that money couldn't purchase safety from consequences that had finally arrived. 15 years, Frank said, his voice carrying the weight of every sleepless night, every bottle of whiskey, every moment he'd believed himself a killer. 15 years you let me think I murdered Danny Chen. You still can't— "Can't what?" Frank interrupted, applying pressure that made Kellerman gasp. "Can't disarm your little death trap?" "Marcus, I've been rigging explosives since you were learning to lie in business school. The only question is whether I disarm it before or after we finish our conversation." He released Kellerman's wrist and stepped back. But the studio head's relief was short-lived. Frank had positioned himself between Kellerman and the door, between the corporate predator and any hope of escape. The detonator lay on the floor between them, but neither man moved toward it. "Look at your monitors," Frank said quietly. "Look at those kids down there. The girl reminds me of Danny. Same idealism, same belief that truth matters more than profit margins. She's probably somebody's protege too. Somebody who taught her that doing the right thing was worth the risk." Kellerman's eyes flicked to the screens showing the 5 trapped students. Sarah had moved as close to the others as the sensor grid allowed, whispering words of encouragement that the audio pickups couldn't quite capture. "Danny trusted me," Frank continued, circling Kellerman with predatory patience. "Looked up to me. Thought Frank Morrison could teach him everything about staying alive in a business that kills people for convenience. And for 15 years I believed I'd failed him so completely that I deserved to die in places where failure has immediate consequences." "The guilt made you useful," Kellerman said, attempting to regain control through clinical detachment. "Predictable. Easier to manipulate when the time came." Frank stopped circling. "The time came the moment those kids found your embezzlement records. Danny's murder was profitable. But it was also evidence. Evidence that pointed directly at you when anyone bothered to follow the money trail." He gestured at the elaborate surveillance setup surrounding them. "This isn't just about silencing witnesses. This is about creating the perfect narrative." Frank Morrison, the guilt-ridden stunt coordinator, finally snaps and takes revenge on innocent students investigating the accident that destroyed his career. Very neat, very believable. The media writes your story for you. "It would have worked," Kellerman said with bitter satisfaction. "Still will work. You can't save them without the disarm codes, and I'm the only person who knows them." Frank picked up the detonator, examining it with professional interest. "Marcus, you seem to be operating under several misconceptions. First, that I need you alive to disarm this system. Second, that I came up here to save those kids." Kellerman's face went white. "What?" "I came up here to have a conversation about Danny Chen," Frank said, setting the detonator on the desk within easy reach of both men. "About what really happened that night 15 years ago. About who was responsible. About what justice looks like when it finally arrives." He moved to the monitors showing the warehouse interior. The timer read 89 minutes, but the students appeared calmer now. Sarah's leadership providing stability in circumstances designed to create panic. "Danny found your embezzlement operation," Frank continued. "Found the safety budget theft, confronted you about it, and you killed him rather than face exposure. But killing him wasn't enough, was it? You needed a fall guy, someone whose reputation could be destroyed to cover your tracks." "The rigging failure was real," Kellerman protested. "The equipment malfunction was caused by substandard equipment purchased with funds skimmed from safety budgets," Frank finished. "Equipment that should have been replaced months earlier if you hadn't stolen the maintenance money. So yes, the accident was real. But the negligence wasn't mine. Frank turned from the monitors to face Kellerman directly. Do you know what I learned during 15 years of exile, Marcus? I learned that some people deserve mercy, and others don't. I learned to tell the difference with absolute clarity. And most importantly, I learned that justice doesn't always look like what people expect. He picked up the detonator again, but instead of threatening Kellerman with it, he began methodically dismantling the device with movements that spoke of intimate familiarity with explosive systems. The beautiful thing about your setup, Frank said as components clattered to the floor, is how thoroughly you documented everything. Every conversation, every threat, every confession. All recorded in digital clarity for investigators to analyze. Kellerman lunged for a backup detonator in his jacket, but Frank moved with reflexes that belonged to a younger, more dangerous version of himself. The studio head found himself pressed against the wall with Frank's hand around his throat, not crushing, but holding with surgical precision. Justice for Danny Chen, Frank said quietly. Looks like you spending the rest of your life in prison while those kids down there live to expose every detail of your operation. Justice looks like your empire crumbling while the truth finally gets told. He released Kellerman and stepped back as sirens wailed in the distance. Police, FBI, media responding to anonymous tips that had been triggered by Frank's arrival. 15 years too late, Frank Morrison said. But justice nonetheless. The sirens grew louder as Frank watched the first FBI vehicles appear through the dust clouds on the desert highway. He'd triggered the anonymous tips 3 hours ago when he'd arrived early and discovered the elaborate surveillance equipment hidden in the warehouse office. A simple dead man's switch embedded in his phone that would release everything to federal authorities if he didn't check in every 4 hours. Marcus Kellerman sat slumped against the office wall, staring at the dismantled detonator components scattered across the concrete floor. His empire was ending in real time as the sirens multiplied and news vans appeared on the horizon like vultures drawn to carrion. You planned this, Kellerman said, his voice hollow. The early arrival, the federal contacts, you knew. Frank shook his head slowly. I didn't know anything. I just learned 15 years too late that preparation prevents tragedy. He gestured toward the warehouse below where the 5 students waited for rescue. Danny tried to teach me that once, about checking the safety margins twice, about never trusting that someone else had done the work properly. The first federal agents were already cutting through the warehouse's main lock, their voices carrying across the desert air with tactical precision. Frank could hear Sarah calling out to them, her voice strong and clear as she guided them past the sensor grids toward the trapped students. She sounds like him, Frank said quietly, more to himself than to Kellerman. Same confidence, same belief that people will do the right thing if you just explain the situation clearly enough. He moved to the window and watched the rescue operation unfold with professional interest. The FBI's bomb disposal team worked with admirable efficiency, following protocols that had been developed through decades of expensive mistakes. No corner cutting, no shortcuts, no assumption that previous work had been done properly, the way Danny would have done it. Mr. Morrison? The voice came from behind him, a young federal agent with intelligent eyes and the careful posture of someone accustomed to dealing with dangerous situations. Agent Sarah Chen, FBI Financial Crimes Division. Frank turned slowly, studying her face. The resemblance was subtle but unmistakable. The same bone structure, the same determined expression, the same way of holding her shoulders when delivering difficult information. Danny's daughter, he said. It wasn't a question. Danny's sister, she corrected. 15 years younger and considerably more suspicious of convenient explanations for tragic accidents. Frank felt something shift in his chest. Not the familiar weight of guilt, but something lighter and infinitely more complex. You've been investigating this. For 3 years, Agent Chen confirmed. Ever since I had enough clearance to access the original case files. The financial irregularities were always there, but Marcus Kellerman was very good at deflecting attention toward personal negligence rather than systemic corruption. She gestured toward the monitors still displaying camera feeds from the warehouse below. The 5 students were being escorted to safety, their voices animated as they described their ordeal to investigators who recorded every word for evidence. Those kids stumbled onto the same embezzlement operation Danny discovered, she continued. Same budget manipulations, same safety fund diversions, just 15 years later, and significantly larger in scope. When they started asking questions about the original Chen investigation, Kellerman decided to eliminate them using the one person whose guilt would make the perfect cover story. Frank watched through the window as Marcus Kellerman was led away in handcuffs, his corporate composure finally cracking as photographers documented his arrest. He was right about one thing. I would have done anything to save those kids. The guilt was that strong. The guilt was misplaced, Agent Chen said firmly. Danny died because he tried to expose corruption that could have killed dozens of people. He died because he believed safety protocols mattered more than profit margins. He died doing exactly what he trained to do. And I spent 15 years in places where decent people go to disappear, Frank said, convinced I'd killed the best person I ever knew. You spent 15 years learning skills that saved 5 lives today, she corrected. Danny would have considered that time well spent. Frank looked at his hands, scarred, weathered, marked by 15 years of hard work in dangerous places where competence was the only currency that mattered. They were different hands than the ones that had taught Danny Chen about rigging and safety protocols, but they were steadier now, more certain. The preliminary evidence suggests Kellerman's embezzlement operation cost the industry approximately $47 million over 15 years, Agent Chen said. Money that should have prevented at least dozens serious accidents and possibly saved several lives. Frank nodded slowly. Danny would have wanted the truth told properly, with documentation, with evidence that could prevent it from happening again. Yes, she said simply. He would have. The desert sun was setting now, painting the warehouse walls the color of old blood. Frank Morrison stood in the window of an office that had been designed as a murder scene and watched federal agents collect evidence that would finally tell the truth about a night 15 years ago. He wasn't the same man who had trained Danny Chen. That man had been destroyed by guilt and good intentions, but he was someone Danny would have respected, someone who understood that justice sometimes arrived late but arrived nonetheless. Frank Morrison walked toward his truck, ready to go home,